Welcome. I'm Christina McGrath, and Charles and I today are going to be doing neurogenesis. So Charles.
Yeah, so neurogenesis, I think, has become a sort of super important subject, only because of, as you probably all know, sort of neuroscience has become the new sort of wonder science. And what they're discovering almost sort of on a daily basis is beginning to change an awful lot of things. So neurogenesis, just to explain exactly what it is, or roughly what it is, I should say, it's a process of how your body and your brain produce new brain cells. And that what they've realized that will come through, and that's most of what we're talking about today, is that new brain cells are actually the key, not a key, the key to enhancing the quality of your life. So, I mean, the way we've sort of formatted it today between Christina and I is that we're going to look at some of the myths that used to exist until quite recently, and then sort of look at some of the truths that they're beginning to find, at least truths for the moment. So the first sort of bit, first thing to explain really is that there are two parts to this in a way. One part we won't really talk about because it gets very technical. One is neurogenesis, which is the production of the new brain cells, and the other is synaptogenesis, which is because of new cells or because of efficient cells. Another area that they've realized is extremely important in having healthy brain cells is this area of synaptogenesis, which is the synapse, which is the connections between cells and the fluids and the hormones and all the neurotransmitters that need to be in the area in order to enable it to happen. And this are things that they're beginning to understand that we can do and should control. So the first sort of big myth was that it was thought that when you reach 20 years old, that was it. All your brain cells are formed, your brain is fully formed, and it's downhill from there. No matter what you do, that's as good as it gets. This, they found, is completely untrue. Now, this was based on the fact that the brain does actually get to fully form by about the age of 20, 21, something like that. And that they couldn't find any, or partly because they didn't have the scanning methods or the analysis methods to actually sort of see, but they couldn't tell whether any new cells are being generated. So they assumed that they weren't and that it was downhill. And in any case, most people get more stupid as they get older, even if they've got more experience. So in the 1950s, this began to change a little bit before the sort of real sort of genesis of neuroscience. And they began to realize that the brain was slightly more plastic, what they call plastic. That meaning that it had the ability to switch its resources, if necessary, to various other areas, and that learning new things was possible. So you weren't stuck with what you've got, and we'll come to that in a moment. Then in about 1990-ish, they realized that the brain could produce new brain cells. And not only did they begin to realize that, more recent science has shown that the importance of these new brain cells. So the truth is, as the myth doesn't show, is that the brain reaches full development in your 20s, but it keeps growing new brain cells and has this ability to grow new brain cells throughout your entire life, no matter what age you are, no matter what you've got, no matter what you've learned. Now, there are other cases that we won't talk about today about dementia and Alzheimer's and all of that, but we won't get into any of that. So in 1990, a guy called Fred Cage from the Salt Institute began working with better neural imaging with fMRI and all sorts of other sort of systems of seeing, and realized that new neurons were seen to form in animals, particularly in the hippocampus. Now, this is also backed up by the very famous study of the English cabbies, who, because of their spatial awareness of London, because they have to go through this training, in order to learn London called the knowledge, that their hippocampus grew as a result. Now, it seems a bit strange that they didn't realize before then that we were generating new brain cells. But they then began to test this in mice first, then in monkeys, and now they've proven it in humans as well. So, and what they realized is that all sorts of varied conditions are responsible for creating an environment in which new brain cells can be produced, but can be nurtured. So that is diet, body, heart, meaning emotions, really, your mind, and spirituality as well, which is probably not what everybody was thinking, but all these things, if optimized, have the ability to increase your quality of life and the health of your brain as well. So the next myth was that aging means cognitive decline and memory loss, and it's a downhill slide and all of that. That's not true. That is not the case. And look, I am living testament to the fact that you can learn new things even at any age. So I am the proof, the living proof. But the most important thing about this is that what they found is neurogenesis, and we'll get into how and why a little bit better in a moment, is the key marker for the quality of life that you produce. If you increase your neurogenesis, the amount of neurons that you produce and their survival, which is also very, very important, you increase the quality of your life. And if you reduce the environment, the conditions under which neurogenesis happens, you will shrink your brain. It's just as simple as that. Proven, shown by fMRI studies and also by studies in mice. They did a very long study studying mice in deprived environments and in enriched environments, and they found that there was a huge difference in the amount of neurons that they produce. Now, their brains are a little bit simpler than ours, of course, but nevertheless, it proves the case. And unfortunately, they've done the same study in monkeys, but not quite so popular, of course, nowadays. And the other sort of the guiding thing, and the thing that intuitively I think we all sort of know and sort of comes together with all of this, is that the quality of your life does depend on the quality of your brain and your ability to deal with things. Now that, and I think Christina and I have been talking about this for ages, is that brain and body are all one thing. It's all the same organism. If you nurture these organisms, then you will have a better quality of life. You'll have a better ability to deal with stress, to deal with emotional problems, with physical problems, with all those sorts of things. So the next myth, your genes determine exactly how you're going to age and how long your brain stays sharp. No. So that doesn't mean you can improve. You do. Back to the experiment with the mice, is that what they found is that mice and humans also lose up to 60 or 70% of the new neurons that you produce, that they don't get nurtured through to actually sort of become active within your brain. And that an enriched environment, which in the case of mice was pretty simple, really, was running wheels, mazes, interesting things, allowed almost all of the new neurons to survive. So that's a huge difference in terms of the quality, and they've proven that now with chimpanzees, and they think they've proven it with humans, and certainly that's the basis of this whole new wave of understanding called neurogenesis. So enriched environments increased neurogenesis up to 4 or 5 times, and increased cognitive ability and increased memory. So, and that's sort of now proven. But what that means is the consequence of all of that is better emotional and hormonal ability to deal with stress, resistance to fear, and stress and depression. And the particular studies that they've been doing recently, and there's one very recent study that's out, is in relation to depression. And we'll talk a little bit about depression, why that happens, because they're now beginning to believe that depression is not necessarily caused by, but is certainly enabled by a low factor of neurogenesis. So that is quite significant, and it isn't necessarily as they thought, and we'll come to that. In fact, we come to it now about SSRIs, which SSRIs, NRIs, NDRIs. This is a study by Jessica Malberg in the year 2000, researching antidepressants and what they did. So SSRIs, if you don't know, and I'm sure you do know, are sort of things that they're called reuptake inhibitors, and they will suppress or increase the potential within a neuron to generate and to work with serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and you probably know all as Prozac and stuff like Prozac, which astonished me. In fact, it's the second most widely prescribed drug in the world. How scary is that? I mean, that is just astonishing. But what they found is that it's not necessarily that the serotonin or the norepinephrine or the dopamine is the actual active ingredient. What it does is it increases neurogenesis. So it increases the ability of neurons to survive and to thrive. So it's what they realized now, and you'll probably see this in a lot of social work and everything else, is that a lot of depression is now being dealt with meditation, with other types of neurolinguistic planning, or types of mental control, rather than using drugs. Drugs, I think, they obviously still use, but in much more severe cases. But there is this undeniable now connection between neurogenesis and depression. And depression is caused by low levels of serotonin, or so they thought. So you would need a lifelong prescription of SSRI drugs in order to treat it. So that's pretty scary, I think. And that's what was the case up until relatively recently. And that's why I think, if I'm not mistaken, Christina, there's a bit of an epidemic of actually sort of prescribing these drugs in the US.
Yeah.
And people are becoming addicted to them because they can't do without them.
Yeah.
Well, so what they think is that antidepressants are not what's working, it's the neurogenesis that's actually working. So if they can increase the neurogenesis, then potentially you won't need the drug. And this has been proven, as I say, to some extent, not totally, but to some extent, that things like meditation are as effective, and so is exercise for that matter, are as effective as the drugs themselves. So if you have low neurogenesis, this causes things like memory loss, cognitive impairment, chronic stress, and stress sort of debilitates almost everything, depression, loss of emotional resistance as well, trauma, reduced immunity as well. So it has an effect on your immune system too. Diminished executive function, that is, your prefrontal cortex, that it actually doesn't operate as well, which is not very good if you've got lots of decisions to make. And a loss of vitality, and eventually increases the onset of dementia as well. And I know that dementia is sort of a completely different area, dealing with sort of with tau proteins and with amyloid as well, and all sorts of other things. So I won't get into that too much, but the whole point of this webinar is basically to say that you can increase the rate of your own neurogenesis if you do the following things. You look after your diet, you look after your body, you exercise, and you look after your emotional health as well, and you look after your mind. So you stimulate your mind as well. And the one that really interests me, that I'm really curious about, is spirituality. Apparently, spirituality is really good for you. Now, I have a slight personal problem with it in one sense, in organized religion, but and I was explaining to Christina, is that Alan de Botton, who's a very well-known philosopher, has written a whole book about the value of religion within society. Now, religion isn't necessarily spirituality, but it's certainly very closely connected with it. So all of these things increase your neurogenesis and also your synaptogenesis as well. And synaptogenesis is something we'll come to in a moment with Bdnf, but we won't go into it too much. So what it means is basically that the brain actually determines everything in your life, which makes sense because you have no other way of perceiving the world. So why wouldn't you want to have a healthy brain? And if a healthy body helps it to be a healthy brain, then that's what you need to do. But the other thing is stimulation. A really, really important part of this, of the whole sort of philosophy of neurogenesis, is that you need to be stimulated. You need novelty as well. You need new things. You need different things. So what I think we're sort of getting at really is that you need to adopt a more neurogenesis friendly lifestyle. And that means looking at your diet, which Christine's going to get into in a moment, looking at your exercise, which we won't get into today, but I think you all know from the other webinar that there is something called a magic bullet, and it is exercise. And that stimulates an enormous amount of different things. We all know about runner's high and all the rest. So and if you think about it, everything that we experience in any way, shape or form is experienced through the brain. It's through our perception. So just a very brief bit about the hippocampus, because it's sort of it's in the middle of your brain somewhere. It's sort of, there are two sides to it. There's a front end and a back end, and it's central. The hippocampus is the thing that is central to a huge amount of human consciousness and various sort of functions in human consciousness. So it is involved in movement and spatial awareness and spatial learning. And that we know from London cabbies who do the knowledge, and they've increased the size of the hippocampus. Interestingly, when they stop, when they retire, it shrinks back. So it just goes to show that you need to keep it up all the time. It's also, the hippocampus is also involved in cognition, in learning, in new memory formation as well, and the processing. Basically, it's a sort of like a little command center right in the middle that says, oh, what should I do with this? Oh, let me chuck this one up to memory. Let me chuck this one up to sensation. Let me chuck this one over to fear, or whatever it might be, because it's very involved in emotion and mood. It's not the generator of the emotions of mood, but it does tell the amygdala what to do with it. This all happens in less than the blink of an eye, of course. It's all very, very fast. But it's also involved in stress and anxiety and fear and depression as well. And it has a very key role in depression too. The hippocampus is also the part that is most active if you're involved in any form of mindfulness as well, which also fascinated me because I had no idea. This is all based on really quite a seminal book by a guy called Brant Courtright, who is a clinical psychologist, and almost everything in his book is backed up by the science as well, and the backing up articles and everything. But spirituality, mindfulness, devotion, compassion are all very good for you. So you should do more of it, basically. And the size and the development of your hippocampus, which is crucial, the command center, is impacted by all of these different types of elements. And neural growth stimulates something that we call neurotrophins. We're getting close to Bdnfs, which we're going to get to. So one of the things that enables new and old neurons to fire with each other across a synaptic gap. So you've got one end here and one end here, and then there's a little spark, if you like, that goes through that certain chemicals, hormones enable to happen. One of the things that that is crucial in all of this is something called Bdnf. We've spoken about it before when we talk about optimal nutrition. And this is brain-derived neurotropic factor. And what this does is it's essential, not just necessary, it's essential for brain development and for synaptic health. And you need synaptic health. Because if you're trying to leap the chasm between neuron to another neuron, and you haven't got the legs to do it, you're going to fall down the middle and just end up nowhere. I don't know what nowhere is like in the brain, but it can't be very nice. Maybe that's what depression is. I don't know. So Bdnf, if you increase your Bdnf, you then increase the possibility of neurogenesis. Whereas if you don't, and you have low exposure, and therefore you will end up with and may engender chronic inflammation, chronic stress, which are all part of low Bdnf and low levels of neurogenesis, apparently. And also deprivation has a very strong effect on your ability to produce new brain cells and to produce the right environment for those brain cells to fire across the synapse. So basically the brain does everything, but the brain is big, you know, it's not just inside here. It also goes all the way down your spine, and there's a lot of talk recently, and has been for some years, about the gut being completely and intimately involved in the brain's process as well, which, you know, makes you wonder why we don't realize more straightforwardly that what you ingest is going to have an effect on you. I mean, if you drink coffee, it does have an effect. If you drink alcohol, it definitely has an effect. If you drop drugs or acid or whatever it might be, you know it's going to have an effect. I don't know exactly how LSD works, so I won't go into that. But my nephew does, and he'll bore us to tears with it. But anyway, so brain basically controls everything. Everything you do, everything you ingest affects your health, and that affects your ability to create and nurture new brain cells. So Christina's now going to sort of take us through diet, because we figured that we can only cover a couple of areas tonight, and diet is extremely important, of course, because that's one of the big things we put in our bodies. Christina.
So diet. So what we're doing with diet, and this is an interesting thing. Am I still a speaker view for you guys? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. So for diet, there's a couple components that we're going to talk about. So first of all, you want a diet high in healthy fats. I think that's extremely important, especially since fat has gotten a bad name in the past. And I think we're going to go into that later as well. Also an inflammatory diet, an anti-inflammatory diet. So in regards to anti-inflammatory diets, there's two things that you want to think about. Is one, what could be sensitive foods to you personally? And then what are inflammatory foods to everybody, which is kind of processed foods, processed meats, high sugar foods. So those are inflammatory to everybody. Low glycemic, and this is how food increases blood sugar. And so there are low glycemic and there are high glycemic foods. A lot of the processed foods are high glycemic foods. Like there are high GI fruits and starchy foods, sugary drinks. A couple examples are watermelon, white rice, cereal, honey, French fries. And then we also are coming to high fiber foods. So foods that move through the digestive tract, allowing it to optimally function. So you want to add those into your diet for neurogenesis as well.
You're back.
Am I?
You're back. Yeah, no problem.
And you also want, so these high fiber foods, we've got beans, legumes, oats, berries, avocados, coconut, figs, artichokes, peas, black beans, So those are all examples of high fiber foods that you can integrate into your diet. Antioxidant rich foods. These are the foods Charles and I were just talking about, which keep you young and protect you against free radicals. So the antioxidant rich foods we're always talking about, the big one, obviously blueberries. So foods that are definitely like high in colors, colorful fruits and vegetables.
You had a great metaphor for, well, not metaphor, but a simile for oxidants, which was...
oh, they're like the anti-rusters. So if you think about your body rusting, these are the foods that you integrate into your body to stay young and not rust. So I really like that one. So yeah. Charles, why don't you come into the evolution of the diet for a second?
Yeah. So there's an interesting sort of theory brought up that that our bodies haven't evolved as fast as our brains, and whether our brains have evolved or not, well, they have, obviously, but in recent times. And one of the biggest differences has been the diet in comparison to evolution, in that basically until relatively recently in human history, we ate wild plants, meat, fish, and that's how our body has adapted to its environment. And the other thing that we were talking about was seasonality, is that we do not have any seasonality at all anymore. So the interesting thing would be with seasonality is that nowadays sugary foods are ever present in everything, absolutely everything, and you can get a quick sugar fix immediately. But in past times, and even I think almost since the 1950s really, where food really radically changed, is that sugary fruits were only available in season. And so you might gorge on them if you found a fantastic apple tree or whatever it might be out on the savannah. If apple trees exist on the savannah, I don't know. And therefore you would eat them, but you wouldn't have them all year round. So therefore you weren't consuming this quantity of sugar. What seems to have happened since the 1950s is the addition of sugar, the addition of salt, the addition of sort of processing into foods in order to make them more attractive. And I think that's we're pretty sure that that's the main reason that we now have an obesity epidemic, certainly in the West, if not across the whole world, is partly because we're not eating food seasonally, and most of the food that we're eating all the time is sugary and very, 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 very heavy for the body to have to deal with. And we'll get to how the carbohydrates and glycation works in just a moment. Fats. You're going to talk about fats, Christina?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So I think that, yeah. So with the fats, I think it's a myth, and we've come across this before, is that fats make you fat, which is not the case. Bad fat may, but not all fats are bad, and not all of them clog arteries or cause heart disease. And carbs, there's also these myths about that carbs are bad or good. And I think we need to understand, Charles and I were talking about this before, is that carbs are fruits and vegetables. So when I talk about carbs, I'm talking about good carbs, fruits, vegetables. I mean, a punnet of blueberries contains a ton of carbohydrates. So thinking about carbs, not necessarily putting processed carbs in front of it, because that could be, obviously not optimal. It's carbs are good and carbs are bad. Processed foods, we know, are kind of non-negotiable. They're not that good for your body. They spike insulin levels and they stay in your system for a long time. And they can not help neurogenesis. And
it's interesting as well because the brain is composed, I think, of about 60% fatty acid, which is DHA, which is very similar to omega-3. So again, we're back to my favorite superfood. And the other 25%, not the other 25%, because there's various other things, but another 25% is cholesterol. Mm. And that really surprised me because, cholesterol was, the devil incarnate in your body. But that's not quite the case. And I'm worried for some of my friends who are now getting a little bit older who are sort of saying, oh, well, you taking statins? I'm taking statins. And not all cholesterol is created equal, is it? I mean, because there's some that is HDL, which is good cholesterol, which helps with all sorts of different, I'm not sure exactly what cholesterol does apart from clogging your arteries, if it's bad cholesterol, which is the LDL type. But I think it produces the hormones that actually regulate glucose, if I'm not mistaken. I hope that's right. And the other thing is that that within that, you've also got another thing that you should be consuming for your brain, of course, is monosaturated fats such as olive oil, avocados, and my new favorite that I'm really pleased that we found out about, butter. I love butter and I hate margarine. Absolutely hate margarine. But butter apparently is not so bad for you. And I don't fully understand why. But obviously olive oil, well known, avocados, very well known. And the other thing about saturated fats, which might surprise some of you, or maybe you all know this already, is that grass-fed meat is full of good saturated fats. Yogurt, coconut oil, that one surprised me too. And I don't know whether you want to say, well, of course, I'm going to mention fish again, and omega-3, but I don't know if you want to say anything about vegetable oil,
well,
Christina.
I think we're going to come up to vegetable oil, but in the oxidation process.
Okay. Well, back to you with sugar, carbohydrates.
So sugar and carbohydrates, we talked about, I think this is really, it almost goes along with that sugar spike or inflammation, but carbs become sugars, and then when blood sugar levels rise, the pancreas secretes insulin and allows cells to use a glucose. So, but like Charles was talking about before, too much all the time, kind of like cortisol, which we've talked about before, too much insulin all the time, we create an insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes. And so our bodies just get resistant to that spike, and then it causes all sorts of problems. So the other thing is that we wanted to mention about sugars is fats exposed to high glucose levels glycate, and chronic inflammation ensues. So I think so that's kind of the sugar inflammation idea right there. Reduction in carbs and sugars and unhealthy fats promote neurogenesis. So we can say reduction, I want to just clarify that, reduction of unhealthy carbohydrates and unhealthy processed sugars and unhealthy fats. And we're going to talk about oxidation in a second. All of those are things that we want to avoid in talking about neurogenesis. So oxidation. So this is what we were talking about just before about our resting. So oxidative stress tears down cells and produces inflammation. So oxidative stress can be from what you eat to environmental toxins to toxins you put into your body, from cleaning products to pollution. So, and then the other thing about oxidation, and this is one of my non-negotiables when I'm talking about reducing inflammation in the diet, is oxidizing fat. So vegetable oils, a lot of vegetable oils are very, very bad for you. And because they say vegetable, people think that they're okay. But what they do is they oxidize, especially at higher heat. Some of the vegetable oils that are okay, like the canolas, the peanuts, they're all very bad for neurogenesis. Olive oil sprinkled on your salads, great. Used in cooking, not so great. So if you're cooking, what you want to think about is ghee, which is clarified butter or grass-fed butter. Those are the two things that I would recommend cooking with. You know, limit or avoid or get rid of any kind of canola oil, peanut oil, safflower, sunflower, anything like that, because it doesn't do anything for your neurogenesis at all. In fact,
the one that amazes me in that is ghee, because over here where we have a lot of Indian food and they use a lot of ghee, we always think that ghee is incredibly bad for you and incredibly fat inducing. But is that not the case?
No, it's not the case. And in fact, like ghee and grass-fed butters, I mean, we know we need healthy fats for the brain. I think we went on this no fat makes you fat diet in the 90s, and we haven't recovered exactly from that. And so ghee, grass-fed butters, and they don't oxidize like we've, I think they don't oxidize like the other fats. And we were talking about that just a little bit before, and how they actually produce a coating on your myelin sheath. But moving forward, so fresh fruits and vegetables contain the antioxidants like we talked about. Blueberries, really high colored fruits and vegetables, that's what you want to add in. Flavonoids, again, fruits with high color.
Chocolate. Don't forget chocolate. Don't forget chocolate.
Chocolate is a great
I'm
one.
now authorized to eat chocolate.
Yes, dark chocolate. So
can't do without chocolate.
Yeah. So chronic inflammation, and I think this is the main thing. We eat every day. So reducing inflammation in your diet helps your brain in so many ways. So chronic inflammation speeds aging, stiffens blood vessels. You have high glycemic foods, which cause more inflammation, and foods that can increase neurogenesis and decrease inflammation. So as we talked about, our kind of top ones, blueberries and omegas. I think those are blueberries and omega-3s, fish. Those are the things that we definitely want to add in. Green tea, and which Sarah and I both said that we have to add honey to.
No, I didn't say that.
I had to add honey too.
I said I don't really like blueberries. In fact, I'm not a big fan of fruit.
Yeah.
And green tea, well, I do try to drink it from time to time, but it's quite bitter and it's quite nasty.
This is better.
And it leaves a terrible scum on the cup as well. So I'm not sure about that.
Oh,
but it's very good for you.
So a couple
I have to find an alternative.
Well, just pick from the list. I think the point here that we're getting at is like, do what you can and kind of take from the list what you want. So blueberries, berries of any sort, your omega-3s, you really want to think about salmons and your nice whitefish.
Yeah, we were talking also about mercury.
A little bit about that. And when you start to increase your intake of fish, you want to think about mercury as well, as we know, and I'm sure everybody's heard of that as well. And those are in the older fishes, in the tunas and the sharks and the things like that, swordfish. So you want to limit your kind of older fish, and you want to always get your wild caught salmons and nice white fish as well. Curcumin in turmeric. So curcumin's a very big anti-inflammatory. Whole soy foods, you do not want processed soy foods, but whole soy foods, very good. Ginseng, ginkgo biloba, both of those I think you find more in supplement form. Chocolate or cacao as well. Melatonin, I'm a huge fan of melatonin. Obviously, we know that promotes a healthy sleep. And they're also using it in different cancer studies as well. I think that's really interesting.
Well, and also melatonin is now being used a lot in regulating our what's it called? Not just our sleep patterns, but also our wake patterns as well, particularly in aging people as well. And there's been quite a lot of studies in that. As with circadian rhythms as well, and working within sort of more natural circadian rhythms that, and I know this from one of the care homes that we were working with, is that they found also, there's quite a lot of sort of academic studies on it, that working with circadian rhythms, particularly with people in old age homes, does improve their quality of life by meaning they're less likely to fall, less likely to be tired, much less aggressive as well. And that's all working with sort of natural light and darkness, as well as keeping the food well balanced as well, and not having high sugar spikes and things like that. The other thing that we've got to mention, and has become really popular at the moment, is intermittent fasting. And I think I'm pretty much right in saying that this has now been proven to be beneficial.
Yes.
And that you should have a period, even if you can't fast for a whole day or whatever, you should have a period where you do not ingest anything at all for about 12 hours. So you could do that from 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning or something like that. We've got a sort of a BBC, I think it's BBC program with Michael Mosley, who's a doctor who has really promoted the sort of the fasting diet of sort of, I think it's 2 days on and 1 day or half a day off, or reduce calorie intake. And I think they've shown quite conclusively now that that certainly is a better method of losing weight and of regulating your metabolism, but also of improving cognitive sort of awareness and involvement. So yeah, so I think intermittent fasting is something that's quite easy to take up if you just increase the span between the time that you you stop eating and then you start eating again in the morning. And you were saying as well about what you should eat first, or what you should ingest.
Yeah. So think about, so if you, a lot of people already do intermittent fasting without even thinking about it. If you stop eating at 6, dinner, and then you start eating again at 6 or 7 in the morning, then that's your fast. That's totally fine. The most important thing that you want to remember is that your first meal after you break your fast is very important. It's very important to your brain health. It's very important to your energy level throughout the day. It ensures that if you have something that's processed and high in sugar, you're probably going to have a dip quite early in the day. You want to be eating something that allows you to be full for the longest amount of time.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that we haven't really covered, and I'm going to just sort of very briefly go over some of them.
So hold on a second, Charles.
Yeah, sure.
I think we wanted to talk about the body and the environment first.
Yeah. So that's what I'm just about to get to.
Okay, cool.
So yeah. So I think what gets underestimated quite often is other external things that make a huge difference to your quality of life. And again, this is now sort of reasonably scientifically proven. And these things are aerobic exercise, which has an enormous effect on the body. And as I said, if there was ever a magic bullet, then this would be it, I think, is exercise. Keeping your weight down, keeping your metabolism going, or encouraging your metabolism, keeping reasonably flexible, and all of these things release all kinds of wonderful hormones and chemicals throughout your body. If doing nothing else than just pumping your blood around a bit faster for a time, surely that must clean through all your veins and arteries, which is what you need. Another really interesting one that comes up particularly in the book by Brent Courtwright is touch, human contact, and that's quite tricky at the moment for a lot of people, being quite isolated. But human touch has been shown, and the studies that I remember on this are with, again, slightly older people who have adopted a pet or taken on a pet, that petting does reduces blood pressure, reduces heart rate, calms people. And this is partly due to this physical contact. So I think, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if on the NHS here, you could be prescribed a little puppy or something. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? That'd be cute. Sex, I'm afraid, sex is very good for you. So we all need to do more of it. So just move on. Sleep, 7 to 8 hours a night. Now, I very rarely sleep a full sort of 7 or 8 hours, but I always wake up without the alarm anyway, and always have done. So I suppose it's a question really of finding your own levels with this.
Yeah, it is. And I do think with sleep, it is the quality of sleep. Sometimes that 8 hours ensures that that's enough time if the quality of sleep isn't exactly right. Whereas maybe you're getting a high quality sleep for a short amount of time.
The other thing that they've shown, of course, is that a lot of neurogenesis happens in sleep.
And in REM.
And they're not quite sure, but they're working on studies, and there are studies out there at the moment, that the brain needs to sort and consolidate memory as well, and repair and clear toxins. Now, this also, I think, relates to a lot of what's happening with Alzheimer's research in terms of the amyloids and the tau proteins, in terms of being able to clear them, that they are naturally occurring, but the brain does need to clear them down. The same thing happens with neurons as well, is that they do get pruned, they do get trimmed, you know, like having a haircut or something. You've got to use the ones that you use, and that's why you need new ones. And a lack of sleep, and I don't know how anybody could ever deny this, leads to cognitive decline. You cannot possibly function if you haven't slept well or are rested. You know, people who work maybe, and I shouldn't stereotype, but I will a little bit, is people who work in the city who say that, you know, sleep is for wimps and lunch is for wimps, and they're wrong. They're completely wrong. And tons and tons and tons of proof and studies show that people who try to pull an all-nighter and work very, very long hours are actually not very productive. They do better to go and get a bit of sleep and a bit of rest.
So one of the best books on that is Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep.
Oh, yeah, because there's been a lot of stuff out lately in the last 2 years, I think, about sleep. And it's really interesting. I haven't really got around to reading much of it, except via sort of some of the reading that I'm doing at the moment. Now, the other big thing, the other massive thing that you shouldn't miss out on is doing new things. Doing new things stimulates your brain, which then encourages and nurtures neurogenesis, which the whole point of neurogenesis is not just to make lots and lots and lots of neurons because you wouldn't know what to do with them, is because that leads to a happier, healthier life and a better emotional life as well, and being more able to deal with problems, with stress, with fear, with all those sorts of things. But doing new things really does stimulate your brain. Now, I like to think of it, and I know it's not absolutely correct, I like to think of it that is then the genesis of finding new neural pathways, new routes to sort of understand things, to make connections, to make new connections. So the broader, the better. As I was saying, when I had a design company, I would fanatically insist that everybody get out and see exhibitions, shows, grungy stuff, bad stuff, good movies, bad movies, read stuff. You need to feed it. You really do need to feed your brain. So I think doing new things, and I think I'm not mistaken in saying that that there was a report out that learning a language or a musical instrument in older age is incredibly good for your brain and your brain health. What there isn't much proof on is whether all these mental games and apps and all the rest actually do anything more than just make you better at Sudoku or whatever it might be. I don't think that's the case with chess, because chess is kind of special, of course. The other thing is sensory stimulation. You do need to feed your senses as well. And this goes also along with brain plasticity, is that if you lose or if one of your centers is impaired, your brain will try to heighten other senses to compensate or to work ways around it. The other thing is music and silence. Two things that are very, very, very beneficial for your brain. Again, proven. Mozart is apparently very, very good for working to, if you have it not too loud, I guess. And silence as well. I think, to be honest, I think we could do a whole webinar on silence and just being quiet, because nobody, or very few people, I should say, stop and do nothing. You know, and apparently your brain really needs sometimes just to sort of say, I'm not doing anything right this moment. So if we keep sort of feeding it with things that we do, then I think it gets distracted from some of its tasks, which must be sort of reorganizing, sorting, and just allowing ideas to flow as well. And the other thing is nature. Nature is very, very good for your brain. So you do need to get out and walk and see and do and be involved in it. I mean, gardening is also, I mean, that's been one of my big things, is just mucking about in the garden, particularly if I get stressed. That really works. So there's, so there's a lot of things that we just couldn't possibly cover today because we're just about out of time. And some of them are my pet favorite subjects. One of them is emotion and how emotion is involved in almost everything we do. You can't function without it, but we can't really go into it, except to say that neurogenesis is very important in stabilizing and regulating emotional responses as well. Because if you imagine everything goes somehow through the hippocampus and then the amygdala in terms of whether you fear, flight, or whatever, that emotional regulation is a very, very important factor within all of this, and emotional stability, obviously. Stress, we haven't really talked about stress too much. We've mentioned it quite a few times, but we haven't really talked about it. But it is also a significant factor in neurogenesis. Mind and mental function, I've just mentioned a little bit about doing new things, finding novelty, interest, doing things that stimulate you, that are interesting. And the other thing we definitely can't talk about today is cognitive decline and dementia. And there's a lot of stuff coming out now about Alzheimer's, dementia, particularly as they think they may have found the triggers for Alzheimer's, I think particularly, but certain other forms of dementia. But the problem is, how do they find it early enough, and can they identify the possibility of the amyloid and the tau buildup? And the one that really sort of surprised me, but doesn't surprise me at all, is spiritual benefits. Is that spirituality really does help your quality of life and helps neurogenesis. But the main point is that neurogenesis is the driver, the method by which we have a happier, healthier life, and that we can support by supporting our bodies, what we ingest, what we do, what we stimulate ourselves with, and all of those things. And avoiding poisons. Don't poison yourself. Don't do stupid things. But the poisons that are difficult to deal with are things like inflammation, of course, and there are lots of different types of inflammation. That Christina knows a lot more about it than I do, I've got to say. Chronic stress as well is very, very difficult to get out of because it becomes a recurring circle. Physical assaults as well also do have an impact on the brain as well. And deprivation, and this was the big example with mice and then with monkeys, was showing that deprived environments deprive your brain just as much as everything. I mean, it sounds so obvious, but it's very, very, very difficult to keep an active and healthy mind if your environment is deprived. We might need to talk to Terry Waite or someone like that, who was in solitary confinement for, what, 4 years or something, whilst he was taken as a hostage to find out what happens. But I think he had a very healthy attitude. And any kind of toxins, just don't do it, basically. So I would advise everybody to, if I can, proffer some advice, is to look at what you're eating, look at what you're doing physically, look at what you're taking in as well in terms of stimulation, and make sure you sleep properly. So those are the pieces of advice that will increase neurogenesis. And don't take in any toxins. And that means listening to too much political crap on the TV as well, because that's not very good for your brain, I'm sure. Interesting, but not very good. So that's where we are today. I'm going to be taking a break for 3 or 4 weeks, just to get some other things done. But Christina and Jana, I think, are doing the next one. Christina,
Yeah.
do you want to tell what it's all about?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So Charles and I, coming back, when we come back in October, we definitely have some things that we're going to announce, including a membership site and obviously more webinars and more educational pieces. So I'm really excited about that. And so Charles is going to be working very hard in his time off.
I am.
And in addition to my course being on as well, all about anti-inflammatory tactics. So Jana is an artist and also our creative course designer for something that we have planned as well. And we'll be talking next week. It'll be a time change. So it'll be 2 p.m. Mountain time, which I think is 9 o'clock your time, Charles. We'll also have those recorded. We'll put them both up on both of our YouTubes as well. But it will be about conserving energy. So we'll talk about how to reduce stress by conserving energy, whether it's what you take in, whether you reduce inflammation, whether it's the kind of movement that you're doing, is it productive or non-productive? So that's going to be a very interesting one. So I hope you can join us.
Great. I look forward to that.
I know.
I will come and listen.
Yes.
I'll be there.
Yeah.
Okay. Great to see everyone. Be well. See you all very, very soon. And
Thank you so
hopefully join in next week.
Yeah.
See ya.
Yeah.